So part of what happens when you do deep integration is you talk a lot, and as we spoke a lot, we realized that we could refine our title and refine what we're doing in this project by speaking of it as being self-transcendence, de-reification, and flourishing. And that's a bit more of a descriptive title of what we're going to be doing. And part of that comes out, of course, a model of the self that's inspired by Buddhism. And I should say that part of when we say that this model is Buddhist-inspired, it doesn't mean that it is Buddhist. Part of the work of deep integration, at least in my experience over the years, over the last 15 years, is that simply taking something that is, for example, Buddhist and trying to study it in an empirical context is not going to work. You have to translate it into something that really will work in the empirical context of the scientific method, whatever scientific discipline you're dealing with. So, for our purposes, the kind of self we are going to be examining, our model of self is not a self that is a hypostasized self, a self that could be considered the controller or owner of its properties, of its virtues, of character. And this is actually the classic target of the critique of self in the Buddhist context. And one claim is that this kind of self recedes infinitely in an epistemic sense, such that it necessarily would have to be trans-empirical. It ends up paradigmatically in the state of isolation or kaivalya, which will be embraced by many non-Buddhist traditions that affirm this kind of self. Instead, the kind of self we're talking about is a relational self. It's a relational self that is developmental, and that develops along with its virtues, along with its qualities. It is constituted, it is co-constituted by its virtues and qualities. Now, in terms of virtues, we're talking about wisdom, first of all. And what we mean by a virtue is that feature which is necessary for maximal human flourishing. And wisdom has many ways of being conceptualized. In the Buddhist context, especially the kind of Buddhism that we're dealing with here, wisdom is understood to be yathabhuta darshana, that is to say, seeing truly, seeing things as they truly are. And this is especially to be understood as a kind of deconstructive moment of embracing what you might call the aporia of being in relation. And most specifically, the idea here is that to be in relation is to be, in a sense, in a logically impossible state, to be neither one nor two. The relata, or specifically the two persons, let's say in a dyad in relation, cannot be completely merged as one, for then there is no relation, nor can they be entirely separate as two. For in that sense, why are they no different than persons who are not in relation? So the state of being in a relation is a kind of aporia, and it's humbling in the sense that all of our explanatory systems, all of the way that we model the world, emerges out of being embodied beings, relational beings. And therefore, all of those models are contingent. At some point, reason falls apart. So this is an important assertion in the Buddhist context about what wisdom means. Wisdom is realizing that our explanatory models necessarily, at some point, will fall apart. And we cannot come up with an explanatory model of the world or of our own experience that will be the final one true model. Now, this is often articulated in terms of the concept of emptiness in Buddhism. And at the same time, however, there is another virtue that is critical, which is the more constructive virtue of compassion. And compassion does indeed mean that capacity for an empathic awareness of another's suffering and the determination to do something about it, to relieve that suffering. But it is also a world-making moment. The deconstruction of the world through wisdom, seeing through our models of the world, is at the same time must be accompanied by a reconstruction of the world, a remaking of the world that is through compassion. But the compassionate world, unlike the afflictive world of suffering, is not self-centered, it is other-centered. So we have these two virtues for the maximal human flourishing in Buddhism, which is called Buddhahood. These two virtues are the virtue of, on the one hand, seeing through our models, in a sense, seeing the contingency of all of our beliefs, if you like, and on the other hand, the remaking of the world through compassion. And these are symbolized very importantly through the icon in the form of Buddhism that's inspiring us in late Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, and the icon of the male and female in union, the icon of wisdom and compassion in union. And one of the great moments for me that has been very liberative in this project is the realization that this icon is indeed a dyad itself. It's about relationships, and that's been part of our inspiration for turning to relationships as a concrete object of our study. Now, wisdom and compassion need to be balanced, just as the icon is balanced, that the two are equally participating in the production of this maximal state, of this state of flourishing. And that the reason for that balance is compassion on its own, without seeing through the models of our world, our models of the other, for example, can become dysfunctional. If one has compassion for another that one sees simply through one's own self-centered model of the other, that compassion can lead to suffering. Likewise, wisdom can actually arise as an enemy, as the term is used here in the Tibetan context. Wisdom can lead to an excess of seeing through one's own models, an excess of seeing through one's beliefs can lead to a kind of nihilism, where one loses all connection with the world. Hence, one needs both wisdom and compassion in balance. Now, wisdom and compassion, of course, are features of Buddhahood. What we're interested in are ordinary people. So we're not going to look at wisdom and compassion per se. We're going to look at very specific features that are the ordinary features of ordinary cognition, which would be cultivated by Buddhist practices. And those two features are going to be, on the one hand, self-transcending desires and emotions as conducive to compassion, and what we call de-reification as conducive to wisdom. Now, de-reification is something that I've been working on with another collaborative project, a number of scientists, Mishi Jha, Antoine Lutz, Cliff Sarin, and that requires a little bit of clarification what de-reification is. It comes out of a Buddhist epistemic theory. Very briefly, reification means that we take our thoughts to be real. We fuse them with the world. And a good example of this is something that's appropriate right now before lunch, which is, for example, let's imagine a basket of strawberries, a beautiful basket of strawberries glistening in the sun, probably organic. Maybe a bowl of hot chocolate sauce is nearby. The smell is wafting toward you. And hopefully some of you, or maybe unfortunately some of you, your mouth is watering, right? The power of the thought to affect the body is quite profound there. That is what we're talking about in terms of reification. It's experiencing our thoughts as real to such an extent that those thoughts, as a kind of embodied simulation, can actually have effects on the body. Now, de-reification is to see through the reality of those thoughts as they present themselves in that fashion. In other words, a de-reified thought is experienced as a representational mental event that is not felt to be what it represents. So when I speak about this feature to undergraduates, for example, I often show this image. Many of you probably know it. And I ask them, what is it? And they say, well, it's a pipe. And then I reveal, of course, what Marquette wrote, which is, ceci n'est pas une pipe. It's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. So that move from seeing it as a pipe to seeing it as just a representation of a pipe is the kind of move we're talking about in de-reification. And these are the two elements that we're very interested in looking at. On the one hand, within dyadic relationships, on the one hand, the element of other-centered emotions and desires, and on the other hand, de-reification, the capacity to see the other without, to see through one's representations of the other.
Thank you, John. So, from a scientific perspective, on one hand, human relationships are our greatest source of health and well-being. Our friends, family, and partners provide a great solace to us. On the other hand, human relationships can be very difficult. Just the mere presence of other people produces the fastest elicitor of cortisol, which is the stress response. And so psychologists are highly interested in the variables that produce positive human interactions and relationships. And Buddhism, in this framework that was just distilled by John, provides some deep understanding of the mental states that support virtue in relationship. So we have three specific aims in our project. First, to integrate the Buddhist framework with psychological literature, including existing empirical findings that support some of the things that John was discussing. Second, to empirically measure experiences of reification and desire as qualities of attention. And finally, to empirically test whether these mental states predict pro-social behavior and flourishing. So I'll quickly unpack each of these. Research on the self presents a great opportunity for deep integration, as I said, because there are several disparate literatures in psychology related to self and well-being, such as positive psychology, literature on self-threat and stress, social emotions, and pro-social behavior. The Buddhist framework of the self unites all of these in the current project, and so we anticipate writing theoretical papers that integrate these ideas. Our second aim is to investigate intentions in daily life and in relationships. Our goal here is not to assess the actual content of people's intentions. That would be very difficult to do and maybe impossible, but instead to assess the quality of the mental state in which intentions arise. And so here we're conceptualizing this as simultaneous experiences of desire, thought, and emotion, and along a continuum of virtuous to non-virtuous states. Our overarching approach is to assess experience as it unfolds in daily life, but to do it in a way that does not depend on directly asking people whether they are reifying their thoughts or experiencing virtuous intentions. Instead, we will use tools to assess key constructs in an indirect way using experience sampling. And here, participants will respond to survey questions on a mobile device in daily life. And there are some benefits to using experience sampling, which I can talk about if you're interested later. And as John mentioned, our goal is to examine these processes within couples and within and between people. So here we will recruit romantic couples from a Boston community. And we're focusing on romantic relationships, but the research here should have implications for research or for relationships beyond the romantic context. They will also allow us to assess whether the quality of one person's mental states impact another's. So I would like to just give a quick example of what we mean by indirect measurement. As an example of reification or de-reification, we're going to assess self-esteem ability, which refers to changes in self-esteem due to specific cues or events, and thereby offers an objective way to capture a person's evaluations of the self over time due to covariates with other types of experiences. We also plan to ask people about their desires using an open-ended approach. What do you want at this moment right now? Rather than asking them if they're experiencing self-transcendent desires. We have some pilot data to show some support for this method, which I can share if you're interested. And I'm going to skip ahead to just cover aim 3 really quickly. What we really want to know is if naturally occurring mental states are related to outcomes associated with virtue, such as pro-social behavior and flourishing. And just as a quick example of each of these, we believe that using social psychology paradigms that assess behavior in the real world is the most important way to assess actual behavior. So this is a paradigm that I've used with my colleagues in the past with some success, in which participants come to the lab and take a seat in a row of 3 chairs. And the 2 females there are actually confederates or actresses pretending to be naive participants. The participant is the one only real participant here. And the third confederate comes from around the corner using a pair of crutches and a walking boot, hobbles in pain as she approaches the waiting area. And then we just simply assess if the real participant gives up his or her seat. And we've shown in the past that contemplative-based training can actually increase the rates with which people give up their seat. But here we want to see if differences between people in their dispositions will predict this behavior. We also will look at some pro-social outcomes among partners. Real quickly, we want to just assess physiological outcomes. Sympathetic synchrony is a marker of poor relationship satisfaction, whereas parasympathetic activity is a marker of high relationship quality.
And this is our way of basically modeling flourishing in a dyadic relationship. This is one marker that we would use for that.
And we're out of time, so we can address challenges and strategies as questions arise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So would it be fair to say that you're basically using Buddhism as an Eastern religion to generate your hypotheses and then using Western social science to investigate them?
That's correct.
Yes.
Yes.
That's exactly
So
what
we're inspired by a Buddhist account of what flourishing would be. We're looking at the elements of an ordinary person. The flourishing is the sort of the maximal state in the Buddhist context. We're looking at those elements of an ordinary person that would be trained in Buddhist practices. And those elements are this capacity for de-reification, which all persons have, and the capacity for other centered emotions and desires, which persons have. We're looking at the dispositions of those persons and to see if persons who are high in those dispositions then also are flourishing in their relationships. That's the idea here. And of course, that's something, one of the impacts we didn't get to discuss is, what's very interesting for a scholar of religion such as myself is the capacity to actually use an empirical method, that then to examine some claims within the tradition and to ask whether these claims hold up to this particular translation of them into an empirical context.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I guess that I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing what is specifically Buddhist. I mean, I got the first part of the presentation, but it seems to me that you could test for something like de-reification without making Buddhist presuppositions. You could do it using techniques such as Walter Mischel has used with children and imagining that certain candies are other things and delaying gratification in that way. So I'm not sure what the specifically Buddhist slant adds here that couldn't already be captured by certain Western scientific psychological experiments.
I think one answer to that, in some ways I'm glad to hear you say that, actually, because I think, again, it's not meant to be sort of Buddhism in the lab. It's meant to be something that's inspired by Buddhist theory and therefore investigated empirically. So the direct translation is very difficult in my past experience. But I would say that the specific feature here that de-reification presents, which we also, my other colleagues and I, hypothesize as being very important to the mechanism of mindfulness, is the capacity to have an experience which would then to have, the capacity to see one's experiences as, in a sense, contingent, to see through their apparent truth. And I believe that that specific way of articulating de-reification is unique to Buddhism and doesn't actually exist in the psychological literature yet. Now, what's fascinating is that that in subjects who are not well prepared for this experience, it can actually become pathological. And the literature that's been, the cases that have been collected by Willoughby Britton, for example, of depersonalization, derealization among some subjects of mindfulness courses is indicative that this can be a disruptive experience as well, this de-reification. So obviously on the far end of the scale and without the right context, de-reification actually can be dysfunctional, just as an excessive compassion, if you like, can be dysfunctional.
Right. So actually, and maybe this is included in your research program, but you weren't able to address it in the 15-minute presentation time, in order to make the connection with the self and desire as seeds of virtue. You need to fill in various Buddhist-inspired hypotheses as part of the overarching framework within which these experiments are going to be conducted.
That's right. Thank you. Thanks for filling them in.
I think the key here is that we're predicting that the clusters of these different states happening together is what's going to be constitutive of virtue and flourishing. So it's not just de-reification by itself, but also the self-transcending desire and other focused emotion states.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It's really it's the combination of those together, especially in dyadic relationships, that we're interested in examining.
Howard and Will?
Oh. So I'm just curious, what pattern of results would reject the Buddhist hypothesis?
Well, we could find that certain things such as de-reification by itself is constitutive of flourishing. So maybe de-reification without self-transcending desire is predictive of flourishing in this way of dyadic physiology. Or it may be the case that some of these specific desires or measures that we are taking are not predictive of flourishing or virtuous behavior.
Right. It could be simply that pro-social, rather other-oriented desires and emotions and de-reification together do not at all correlate with our physiological measure of dyadic flourishing, or with pro-social behavior. I would be surprised by that, but it's entirely possible that would be the case. One interesting possibility is that someone is very high in compassion, if you like, and other-oriented desires and emotions, and low in de-reification, and that could be a person who's very pro-socially active, a person who would get up and give their seat. So it's possible that there can be a kind of flourishing, or at least a kind of pro-social behavior that violates this model. And I suspect that we may see some of that. I may even want to interview some of those people.
Hi, Paul. You offered to describe the benefits of experience sampling. I'd actually like to hear what you said.
Oh, you'd like to hear more about experience sampling?
I'd like to hear what you say the benefits are. Yeah.
Oh,
I went too long.
Thank you. The strengths of it
Yeah.
in particular. So what I mean here is that We all know that there's some limitations with self-report and that they're biased by self-presentation demands and things like this. But experience sampling data particularly are powerful for predicting objective behavioral outcomes and physical and mental health outcomes. So there's a lot of data showing that profiles of people's emotional experience predict things like their levels of depression, their cardiovascular risk as measured with objective measures like psychophysiology. So experience sampling has been shown to predict these objective outcomes.
Owen?
So my question is related to Nancy Snow's in a certain way. I guess I wonder about the conjunction in the hypothesis of three ideas. The de-reification, self-transcendent desires, and other focused emotions. It seems fairly obvious to me that if you have self-transcendent desires and other focused emotions and you're in a dyadic romantic relationship, things will go better. But I wonder what, I think we already do have language for de-reification in some sense. I mean, we have distinctions between like, well, there's projection. I mean, there's all kinds of old ideas about healthy relationships that one, if I do project in my thoughts about who and what you are and don't let your reality speak to me. So I guess I'm wondering a little bit about how you, too, since you're the psychologist and the philosopher up here. So John presents this idea of de-reification, which he says is not really there yet in psychology. And you want to test it, but I'm worried about operationalizing it as a three-part conjunction, and I'm puzzled a little bit about in what ways the idea of reification is new. So those are maybe too much, but.
So the question is, why is reification or de-reification a new construct?
Yes.
I would say that it's not entirely a new construct in psychology itself. So David Fresco has a measure of decentering in which people self-report on their extent to which they think that their thoughts are real, the extent to which they think their thoughts are accurate representations of reality. But that specific idea hasn't really been applied in this way of combining it with the self-transcendent desire in the dyadic context.
So another way to put my worry, though, too, is that why wouldn't we have three different hypotheses that de-reification causes good romantic relations, self-transcendent desires do, and then other focused emotions? I'm just a little worried about why they're being...
The three, so the concept here is that that on the one hand, think of situations, and you may know them, in which there is excessive other focus in a relationship.
Okay.
So that excessive other focus is, on our model here inspired by Buddhism, involves a kind of reification of the other and of the self. And that excessive other focus is dysfunctional. It leads to unrealistic expectations, it leads to jealousy, it can lead to loneliness, and so on. Right? So that excessive other focus on this model is going to be tempered by a kind of de-reification, which is the capacity to see that one's model of oneself and of the other, or of the relationship itself, is contingent, it can change, maybe there's another perspective. And that's built on this basic cognitive capacity, which I don't think, even though, so Paul mentioned David Fresco's model, that's very recent. So this idea of de-reification connects to is, in the literature, we have cognitive diffusion, coming out of ACT, we have decentering, mindful awareness is something Larry Barcelona and Esther Papias used. There are a number of terms that have been, cognitive insight is another term that you hear. So you hear it mostly coming out of the mindfulness literature. But it's this specific, it's a little bit more than projection because it's trying to get down to the level of the specific cognitive moment of having a kind of aha moment where you see that your representation is false. So that specific cognitive moment is, I think, not well conceptualized actually in the literature, as far as I know. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that it's been well conceptualized yet. And that's what we're interested in trying to measure. And indeed, you're right, operationalizing it, we have some ideas. That's one of our challenges that we didn't get to. But operationalizing de-reification in particular is something, we have some ideas for that, and it's something we definitely want to explore further. We think it's fairly novel, actually.
All right, our time is up. Thank you so much.